Now we can actually get to the substance of the actual feats, yeah?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So we've.
Alright. So you want to start? Have everything else established?
Fanta, you said you are recording.
Yeah, he's recording.
Yeah. So I think we are good to go. Yeah.
Alright,
So
so
if you want to just. Yeah, never mind. It's got the. Never mind. Discord
alright,
sound effect.
so and just to clarify, we're going to be doing like a method where we present a feat, the other can kind of cross-contaminate, we can talk about its validity, and
Yeah.
then we should be able to move on to the other, yeah.
Let's do it like this and see what you agree. We can each take a turn essentially presenting our feat, just presenting it without the cross contamination yet. And once we've both presented our feat, then we can go into the.
Okay, I would grant that, but first I have to ask, do you have any win conditions?
In the sense that.
Like, if I grant A, then Koji will immediately take EP from Johan.
I mean, I don't know about necessarily that. What I will say, based on what you told me initially, that your premise is essentially that Johan transcends EP. Is that still true?
Yeah, he transcends the branch.
Okay. So I suppose it would be disproving that.
Yeah, so, and my win condition would then be, I'm assuming you don't think Koji transcends EP, right?
No, I think it's impossible for any non-omniscient character to transcend.
So, if I can prove that Johan transcends EP, then that would be my win condition. That should be fine.
That would be, yes, that would be above.
Alright, so do you want to start us off?
I'll let you take us off because you're starting with that.
So
you're starting with
that's
that.
fine. I'll start. So first, I would like to basically, clarify that my argument is that narratively and consistently throughout the entire story, Johan is depicted as basically a superhuman in the ability to identify, understand the human mind. I have scans for all this, by the way, so you can request if need be. So basically, he can understand the human mind perfectly. He absolutely understands it. And he can do this without any external stimuli, or at least any external stimuli that can then be reasonably connected to an emotion or mental state. So for this reason, I would then say that given he doesn't actually fit the standard for needing any sort of, stimuli external, then there's no reason to assume that he actually abides by the model, i.e. the methods used to actually measure EP. Therefore, if he can't be measured in EP by the model, then he would transcend the branch, not because he is perfect, as in he understands everyone's emotions altogether, but he has the ability to effortlessly and perfectly identify any emotion or mental state without any external stimuli, which would make him immeasurable, therefore transcendent over the EP branch by my definition that I sent earlier and that we had that little meta debate on. So I expect some pushback on this, but I think it should be fine. All right, you can go.
Oh, that's all you got?
Yeah, it's basically just that he's immeasurable, therefore, he has to transcend it because he can't be put into any sort of measurement, and that would obviously make him above the model because he can't, be put into the model.
Okay. So I can go ahead and present Koji's feat, but I mean, just right off the bat, I would say provide me some kind of evidence of transcendence right there.
Okay,
because
so are you asking for scans of him having narratively perfect understanding of the human mind? What are you asking for exactly?
Yes, either scans or a specific feat showcasing him, doing this, performing EP without the need for observable cues or anything otherwise. That everything, without any of that, like right now, because you haven't listed any feats yet. You've just said narratively. Which isn't necessary. I'll say it's if you want to present your feat as like a narrative instance, like that's fine for the purpose of this debate. But because you're doing that and you've only presented it as the narrative, nothing you said has yet been validated, so nothing you said can be taken as true as of right now. So with what you just said, basically is nothing until you provide evidence that it exists, because you have not listed a specific feat yet. So you could
There's a
drop.
couple, so I'll send them in
So
scans.
yeah, go ahead and do that then. And then once we establish that is what you're basing it off of, I can go ahead.
All right, so feel free to ask what the connection is, because this is probably just gonna look like a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo. But feel free to ask on the connection. Also, I should find the Alex one too. Hold on.
I don't know why it is, but the scans are like really tiny when I click on them. I think
Which ones?
all of them.
Oh yeah, the top ones. That's because they're snippets from the light novel, so they're a bit weird.
Well, the manga panels too. It's like they're little tiny. Just whatever the sizing of the
Yeah.
images you have are like tiny. You can barely read them.
And then, if you want, I can also get the one for Alex. But if you also just know that feat, then obviously I could just say it, which is basically him realizing his memories with his
So
mother.
go ahead
in the
and
sunflower field.
put drop scans for any feat that you're going to use if you want the feat to be considered. Let's go with
Okay,
that.
hold on.
I'm still reading these because I have to like, zoom in so much to read them all.
And if you want further connection of these and how they make sense in his, elimination of the Springer's strategy, then I can also get into that. Though that's more of a reasoning behind the feats and the connection to the scans than it is actual just more scans. Obviously, at that point, I'd just be sending the whole manga, but so many
No.
intentions you have or the connection.
Okay. So I just slight tangent. Whatever you did when you sent the second batch of scans, if you did something different from the first batch, do it the way you did it the second time because it gives me like the actual full screen of them and I can read them.
Oh
I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah. So basically, the other ones I had to snip, and then those ones were copied straight from the manga, which made it
Oh.
obviously in better in form. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if that's actually feasible to do that for every scan you have, but I mean, but okay. So you presented your side. Is there anything else you want to present in kind of, I guess, your argument of Johan transcending EP?
Well, no, I have more for justifying him actually transcending the model. This is just for him having proof of being narratively perfect in understanding of the mind. The actual transcendence of the model doesn't come from that. That's more of a something I'm waiting to see what your contentions actually are, and then I'll get into that if need be. But first, I just want to see the Koji feat because I really know barely anything about the guy.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, I'll mute. Just tell me.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, and if that's all you wanted to present for this for now, I'll go ahead and then we can start our back and forth. I'm just going to get my scans pulled up so I can drop them as I go. There we go. All right. This. So I'll drop scans as I feel appropriate, but I have scans for pretty much this entire scene. So if you want more clarification on something once I get to the end or just once I get to a different part of it, just let me know and I'll grab them.
All right, that works. That's fine.
We'll just go from there because I've got the actual pulled up here, so I could just. There we go. All right, so the feat that I'm using for Koji's EP is the Old Maid feat from Year 1, Volume 8, which is during the mixed training camp. And this is a scene where Nagamo and a group of the other second years come into the area where Koji and the first years are and propose a game of Old Maid between representatives of each of the 3 grade levels to determine who's going to have to do the cooking for their team for the rest of the week. However, this was all a guise of Nagamo, who had just recently learned that Manabu actually was holding Koji in really high regard. And because Nagamo has been trying to essentially get this kind of recognition from Manabu for the past 2 years, is immediately interested and slightly jealous of Koji for having this recognition as a first year. So the real purpose behind his visit to the first years is actually to try and get some information on Koji and figure out why Manabu finds him interesting. So when this happened, Nagamo, before he ever showed up, had prepared a multi-layered psychological trap to try and mislead Koji and to try and pull information out of him on how he thinks, how he approaches things, and kind of how he just acts based on certain information. So, despite the fact that he proposed this as just playing a game, he then was acting, he being Nagamo, with contradictory behavior and different patterns to try and test how Ayane Koji is going to process misinformation and to see potentially what misinformation is he even noticing. On one hand, he started out by creating the illusion of fair play by opening the deck of cards they were playing with from a sealed plastic package, and then having people from other grades shuffle the deck. That way, he could create the illusion that the entire thing is completely fair, and there was no possible way that he could be cheating in this game. He didn't mention any notion of cheating. He just wanted to create the idea that there could not be possibly cheating. However, throughout the course of the game, he proceeded to predict the outcome of each of the 6 matches before even the cards were dealt on which grade level would lose. And he had the second year students accompanying him act in contradictory ways throughout the matches in trying creating a further sense of ambiguity. And as mentioned previously, this was all done to try and profile Ayane Koji's reactions to all these different types of information to try and figure out what he thinks of it. So this started with Koji's EP. He noticed all the different subtleties that I mentioned of Nagamo presenting it as fair and the different ways that the second years acted. But then the next thing he noticed as they were playing was that some of the Joker cards, and just a quick Old Maid fact, if you've never played Old Maid, the purpose, the way you win Old Maid is you're essentially drawing cards from other players, and the person who ends up with the Joker at the end loses. And Nagamo had marked the Joker card right after they shuffled and they began dealing initially. That way he could see which one, and the second years knew about this ahead of time, that the Joker was marked in like a subtle way. And I believe it's this scan. It's the right one. No, that's the wrong scan. This one. Yeah, that's okay. So it started with noticing the suspicious behavior of the second year students and the marked jokers. They would alternate between hesitating to select a card from his hand or someone else who was holding the joker, and then quickly regaining their composure, which allowed him to identify that they were aware of the marked cards, but were instructed to not always avoid it or collect it. Then combined with taking note of Nagamo's ability to predict each game correctly, which would, based on chance, not be possible. And then further looking at Nagamo's behavioral tactics, being one, his extreme confidence going into the game, contrasting the idea that he's presenting this as a fair game. So the idea that he's both highly confident in his ability to win while also simultaneously trying to broadcast this as just the game of chance without saying he's going to win initially. Then one of the later pieces of note was that Koji noticed that Nagamo was deliberately feeding misinformation to himself and the other players, suggesting that different players would win at different times or that he would lose, all again within his air of confidence. And Koji was able to realize that this wasn't just a display of arrogance on his part, but rather a calculated attempt to manipulate how people were perceiving him and the progress of the game. And furthermore, that this was a deliberate attempt at vagueness to further, again, obscure his larger strategy of creating psychological confusion in an attempt to steer the games towards specific outcomes. Then, Koji was able to take all these factors from observing Nagamo's behavior and his way that he presented through the game, and then rather than being drawn into these deceptions, he was able to deconstruct this entire strategy based on Nagamo's actions and different cues in real time, and was able to put together that the purpose of this was actually to evaluate him. And from there, he was able to identify that Nagamo's strategy in using the marked cards and determining who would win each time, all based on his actions and other different observable cues that I mentioned previously. So let me pull 3 scans.
All right, is that the entire argument?
Um, Sorry, just about scans. But then the basically just the conclusory piece of just presenting the feat.
Okay, so I just have one question, literally just
Yeah,
one.
sure.
So when you said that Anakoji had realized that he was deliberately spreading misinformation to both himself and his teammates, how did he know it was deliberate?
Let me find the. It is this one and think one of these scans I already posted, but I'll put these two together just because of the question. He knew it was deliberate because of the fact that the other second-year students were in on it. Because they were part of Nagamo's intentional deceptions here, he was able to piece that this wasn't just like chaos for the sake of chaos. This was deliberate attempts at deception calculated with other people to try and make the deception more widespread. But
Okay, so then I really don't have any disagreements with the feat. It sounds like a good feat, it's definitely EP. It's just I obviously think, Johan massively outscales due to not only transcending the branch, but
I'm
even my feats.
I'm not trying to argue that the theoretical idea of transcending EP wouldn't be above this. Again, that's not
Yeah,
my
so
point.
do you have any contentions to my argument? Or do you need any elaboration?
Yeah, so we can this is fine for presenting the feat for now. So
I'll just stick to my win con.
Yeah, so I guess now for the back and forth. With what you presented in terms of scans and feats, I don't necessarily have any contentions with how the narrative portrays him. That's not what I necessarily disagree with. I agree that the narrative presents him as essentially superhuman in intelligence and with respect to his own verse and his ability to essentially understand and perceive the emotions of others to be above that of anyone else in his verse. I think you conveyed that narratively, and I agree that's what the narrative portrays. I would disagree that meeting those qualifications doesn't mean you would transcend EP, because I could make the exact same argument about Koji, not with this feat specifically, but using his upbringing in the White Room and his contentions and comparisons with everyone else in his verse. Essentially the exact same type of narrative. So I would argue that necessitates the idea of transcending EP. So I think that's where we need to go next. With you want to go ahead and present why you think Johan's narrative necessitates that he actually transcends the EP branch, and then I can touch back on that once you do that.
Yeah, so basically, I'll make a couple things clear. So, one thing, right? So, when we talk about the model, what we kind of agreed on in our first little meta debate is that you have to be able to reasonably infer a emotional or mental state from the cues. And that's kind of the whole point of Johan. The fact that he doesn't reasonably infer these things, but rather seems to just know them, makes it so that his EP is basically immeasurable. So I think the misunderstanding might be that I don't think that he knows all emotions, like, say, an omniscient being would, where they know all emotions of everyone. I think, in relation to my definition that I presented earlier, he has the ability to accurately, with 100% accuracy, always understand the emotions of everybody all the time, if he desires to. And he can basically do this to the extent that he can find exact memories, for example, with Jurgens, where he recreated the cellar that he was beaten down to every single detail, so much that Jurgens was in the cellar for, I believe it was stated to be either several hours or 8 hours, and he still couldn't find a difference, to the extent that he actually convinced him that Fru was his mother, and then he went on to kill her, right? So,
okay. So just real quick with the cellar point that you're making, because in principle, I don't disagree with like 99% of what you just said in the nature of that feat. Just the problem is the reconstruction of the cellar was an EP, so it's not relevant to Johan transcending EP.
Okay, so
the cellar feat would fall under like emotional manipulation of creating this environment to manipulate and kind of break Jurgens. So,
well, the emotional manipulation is, what he intended to do with the cellar, but I'm saying the identification of the actual information used in the cellar feat, that is the actual EP, right? So, yeah, the feat itself is emotional manipulation to get him to kill his mother. More so, actually, logical, as he could not find a single difference from his memories. But that's not really what I'm focusing on.
That's not the point. So focusing just on the EP point.
Yeah, just the EP. I just kind of mentioned that to say that even through being in the cellar for hours, he could not find a difference, showing the
Sure.
accuracy of Johan's identification of his memories.
Okay.
And so,
And then I just wanted to touch on something you said earlier.
Mhm.
See if it get you. You mentioned that Johan could or has EP'd someone without the existence of certain like observable cues. What example are you drawing to for
so
that?
I didn't say he has done that. I said that that's a narrative, like he would be able to do that, right? And that's narratively supported through mainly the
Oh,
kindergarten
okay,
argument and
I
the
see. So
yeah,
in that case, I'm going to
fire.
go ahead and dismiss that if he doesn't have an actual example of doing it.
Okay, so why would you dismiss it if it's narratively
Because
supported?
because the narrative. Okay, so I guess this. I don't want to drop into another meta debate here, but I when okay, how do I even say this properly? So in the idea of presenting why Johan should transcend EP, using his narrative implications as part of that is fine. Using his narrative implications to then take it a step further of why he should be able to do something he's never been shown to be able to do is not fine.
Okay,
So
so
because you're now creating a leap in logic where you're saying Johan is able to perfectly identify emotions in people, which perfect just in any sense of a feat is flowery language. So throw that out for but that is accepted in the narrative because he's shown and there are tangible examples you can point to, have already, of Johan identifying emotions in people. You're then using that to say he should be able to do that without observable cues. And that's why he should transcend, but that's just a leap in logic in your part. You can't actually validate that. There is no actual evidence that Johan could EP someone without observable cues. And in fact, it makes far more logical sense to assume he can't. Because the whole
okay,
you're saying Johan has never been shown to do something. Narratively, you think he should, therefore he transcends the entire idea of EP. I'm going to heavily challenge that. And on something like that, the burden of proof would absolutely be in your court to prove that based on existing feats of Johan, it makes sense and that he can do that.
yeah, so as I kind of sent in scans, right? So it's not the fact that he, for example, used some sort of external stimuli with Jurgens or Alex or anything like that. What I'm saying is that if we use his feats and statements, then it's fair to assume the author is trying to convey this ability. And then if the author is trying to convey this ability without expressing it, then
But
it is
that's where I'm
fine to then.
disagreeing. I don't think it's fair to assume that the author is
Okay,
trying to
why?
convey this ability because he's never been shown to do it.
Okay, so do you think the only way that a character can be said to be able to do something is through feats?
If okay, no, if there were an actual statement where Johan was stated to be able to do this, that would be different. But you're telling me there's not a statement of this that you are pointing to. You're saying there's a narrative saying he could do this. And saying that there's a
Okay, yeah.
narrative that Johan can EP someone without any kind of observable cues, I'm just going to dismiss that outright from this debate if you can't prove it. The whole point of a debate is you proving that Johan is transcending EP,
Oh, yes,
not that you
obviously, but what
not
I'm
that you
asking.
think. No, so either prove that Johan can EP someone without observable cues, not that you interpret the narrative as he can, prove that he can. Then it will be recognized, and then it would be part of the idea. Otherwise, like I'm not. I want to be clear. I'm not doing this in my argument, but I could very easily take an opposite but highly similar stance, like I said before, with Koji, because he has the similar narrative of being completely transcendent to everyone else in his own verse in terms of intelligence. He's never been shown to be able to EP someone without observable cues, but I could make the argument that narratively, because he's so transcendent, he's so perfectly able to identify emotions in other people, he could do that. I'm not, because I don't think that's valid and that's not valid in terms of a debate to try and present a feat like that. So unless you can provide some kind of actual tangible evidence that Johan does this, that entire line of he can EP someone without observable cues part of your argument just needs to be dismissed entirely. So I rambled there a little bit. Sorry. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Just try not to cut me off on this point, right? So first, I would just like to kind of posit that I would like to ask, when you say, for example, that it is my duty to prove it, I would agree with that. But you're kind of using very strong equivocal terms where I'm asking, what does it mean to prove in this context? In my opinion, it is to just posit an idea that is very probable within a story. And if the only contention is that he hasn't done it or been stated to, and I quote, like, oh, well, Johan can't identify anything without external stimuli, I would obviously say that is flawed because just applying any sort of low-level contextualism, I think it's completely unfair to assume that an author has to convey something very directly for it to then be assumed to be the case, especially with a character like Johan. The whole point is his vaguity, where, for example, he stated that he can just delve into the hearts of any human, possibly, right? And that's by the guy who was actually investigating Johan right at the front with Tenma. So when something like this is stated, the question is then, well, why would I dismiss that? Or why am I looking for something that would directly state what I'm saying in order for it to be valid, right? Because I'm not trying to argue it's 100% the case. I'm saying it's a very probable conclusion, and given that, it's completely fine to use it, right? So I just want to make a couple things clear. One, how do you define proof? What theory of truth are you using? And what exactly would you expect for me to be able to use this as valid, other than a direct statement or feat that absolutely proves it? That's about it.
All right. So to answer your first question, how do I define prove? Well, I don't have a different definition of prove than just the actual definition of prove. So just did a quick Google search here, and I can just read this to you. I can also screenshot this if you care. Just from Google, the Oxford definition of prove is to demonstrate the truth or existence of something by evidence or argument. You can go into the different sub-definitions and such. But essentially, the idea of to prove is to establish the truth of something, the validity of something, or the existence of something through evidence. So, to your point of to prove something, you only need to show that it's likely is just factually incorrect, the definition of prove. And we're not here to get into a meta debate of what is truth right now, and I have no interest in doing that. But basically, to your point about drop this here, I didn't think that'd be a definition we need, but that is proof. Establishing a narrative of something is not proof of an ability. That much, I imagine, should be crystal clear in the idea. The narrative shows implications based on interpretation of a work. So it is in the same vein as like analyzing a character's writing. Whereas you're making interpretations, and based on, a structured way to do that, you can come to similar interpretations as other people who are doing it, completely unrelated to you. But that doesn't establish proof of things that objectively happen. To do that in this context, yes, you would need to either provide a specific feat or instance showing Johan doing this, or even just a statement establishing that he can, outside of just the narrative implications of him being perfect. So that's what I would say to this. If you have, a specific feat or something that you can point to of an instance, or even where it's implied that Johan could do this through actual statements, would help your case. But to my understanding, based on what you've said, you haven't provided anything like that. So I would posit that at least this section of your idea of transcendence is just factually wrong, or at the least factually unprovable, which means it can't help your case.
Yeah, so once again, one thing I wanted to just make clear, I Googled definition of proof, right, by Oxford, what you cited, and I actually didn't find that definition. I found demonstrate the truth or existence of something by evidence or argument. And this is an argument, and it's an argument from consistency, where I'm trying to basically say that, well, given he has the ability, right, to consistently and effortlessly identify extremely minute details of, for example, someone's memory that cannot be inferred from, let's say, an expression or body language, or at least reasonably so. And it is completely fair to say he's doing something else other than using these types of cues that you would expect. And given his process is completely inexplainable, I would then argue it's more likely that he doesn't really have this type of process and instead has a inherent understanding of people, which is also shown in the scan. I think it was the bottom one. No, the sixth one, where it talks about his ability to delve into the human mind, and that comes from Braun, who was working with Tenma on the case and actually very involved in it, as well as being a established psychoanalysis who made a whole profile of Tenma and Johan, and then came to this conclusion in the light novel after the whole case was established and everything is basically revealed. Then he comes to this conclusion. So I believe it to be valid in line with the other feats. I think it's fair to say that. And I'm not arguing from a state of it has to be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. I'm arguing that it is reasonable and quite probable in comparison to saying he uses external stimuli, but we have no idea how he's doing that because even in that case, he would transcend the model because it would be immeasurable. You have no idea what he's doing. He's just using some sort of method that can't actually be measured. He doesn't need to look at the face. We see this with Jurgens, so he doesn't need expressions. He doesn't need tone of voice. We see this with Jurgens. It's not body language, as with Alex. He was able to identify him walking in a field with his mother, as well as his mother's past. So it's none of these. So the only other possibility would be abstract art, but as in our meta debate earlier, we can't even really say what you would need to identify without using some sort of cue that's already established, which once again he could not do in any of these cases. And then you would just ask, well, what is he doing? And if we can't say that, I think it's quite fair to say what I'm saying, especially in line with the statements that I sent from the light novel, especially the sixth one. So, but frankly, I think it has been proven in this context, right? But if you have any more disagreements, then I think we kind of have to go into a meta debate on truth and what it means to be true or false, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. As you're going to be expecting a statement where I think I've already established some sort of line of reasoning, as in the definition by Oxford, depending on how you're defining it.
Yeah. So first I'll just go back to that sixth image you're talking about, where it's mentioning that said he could simply dive into the hearts of any human being. So you are presenting that as established fact regarding Johan. However, it's in this case equally likely flowery language. So we can start there. Delve into the hearts of people is not a literal sense of words. So you were trying to present it as he can literally just look at someone and know and understand them. And while that is true in an implications standpoint, that could just as well be referring to normal EP, which you've also established that Johan does. By looking at people, you've established that in some of his feats, he does use, standard cues to draw inferences about logical and emotional factors regarding people. So this could very well just as easily be referring to people talking about him doing that. Because anyone doing this doesn't necessarily understand how Johan's EPing people. And I think that's part of the idea in Monster, is that Johan's ability to understand people isn't necessarily understood by other characters. So trying to establish that he delves into the heart of any human being means that he could draw from other factors just doesn't tie. Then, the second piece that I wanted to talk about is, in your own argument, you've actually kind of argued against the idea of Johan actually transcending EP to the point where I think you've actually already contradicted yourself. And you see what you have to say with this. But let me just explain what I mean. In the sense that transcending EP would mean that you're able to go above and beyond, surpassing the normal limitations of what would be standard as EP. And you'd have to be able to do this by exceeding the threshold and surpassing what's achievable by ordinary means, which you are positing that Johan can do because you're talking about these non-observable factors that he's picking up on. However, in order to actually transcend EP, which would be above the model, you would need to be able to do this operating under the conditions where normal EP is either impossible or otherwise absent. However, I bring this up because you're still talking about him using observable cues in this feat, in his just general EP feats. And the fact that he's doing this using observable cues, as we established all the way in our initial meta debate, is in the standards of regular EP. Which means if Johan is using these observable cues in any point of this feat, whether he's also using other elements to put these things together or not, he is using parts of the EP model and the standard EP model in his feats, which means, logically, he cannot then be transcending the model as well. That is a disconnect. So, because he cannot be transcending the model in its entirety, because he is operating under the constraints of the model as part of this feat, the idea that he transcends the model is already disproven in that regard in its entirety. So, the fact that he is using observable cues would disprove your premise right there. Then, pretty much all your other narrative fluff kind of falls into that same regard, and also touches on something that we kind of addressed earlier on, the idea of intuition playing into EP, which you haven't really addressed since the beginning when we started talking about these feats. Whereas, even if you're using intuition, which again we agreed on earlier on, as based on these observable cues, that still qualifies as EP. And by the nature of it qualifies as EP, it means it qualifies as measurable EP, which again would be evidence for him not transcending the model as a whole. So really from those 2 points right there, based on your own arguments on kind of the last thing you talked about, you pointed out how it's logically impossible for Johan to transcend the EP model. And then third point here, kind of final point on this, just kind of touching on what it would actually mean to transcend the EP model as a whole, and why I'm asserting here that it's just not possible for Johan to do this. It would mean that in his EP, he would have to do it completely absent of anything of the standard model, meaning no kind of observable cues or standard points of an EP model. So he'd have to be able to gain this perfect understanding of person without ever seeing them, without ever hearing anything about them, without ever seeing anything they've done, without having any kind of connection with them, knowing nothing about them, and then being able to EP them. That's what transcending EP would be. Because otherwise, what you're doing is not transcending. You're then using information and cues you have about them to build a profile. You could argue that parts of it that's not based on observable cues could be psychological profiling, which is another element you could say similar. It is similar to EP, but not exactly the same. Or even using intuition as part of that could be part of it, but again, is not EP. It's a slightly different branch of called emotional intelligence. But the idea of transcending EP as a whole would require a complete transcendence of all the factors required as a part of EP. It's like, to use an analogy here of, where would we do it? Like from like a power scaling point of view, if you transcend something, you have to transcend every notion of that thing to actually be transcending it. Otherwise, you're not actually transcending it. So, for example, if you transcend speed, you can't just be, infinite speed. You have to be beyond the actual concept of speed. In this case, you would have to be above the concept of EP, being able to EP where normal, EP conditions are completely absent, which, as you pointed out, each of Johan's feats is just not the case. So none of these feats are evidence of him transcending EP at all.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. A lot. But first, I'll touch on just the first thing you said, which was just a tracking error. So you said that I was trying to present the sixth scan, where he says, delve into the hearts of any man, right? As an established fact of Johan. You said that verbatim, but I never actually argued or even implied that to be the case. I'm using it as supporting evidence. In fact, I've actually stated many times I'm not trying to prove anything beyond shadow of a doubt. I just am trying to give some supporting evidence for this narrative being true and, in fact, probable. Next, though, so you said there would have to be an absence of any of these, right? Any of these, I guess, information. So you can't have any information on the person, can't know anything about them, and then still understand their emotions, right? But that isn't
In
actually
order to
true.
transcend EP, yes.
Yeah. So two things. One, your transcendence definition, the parallel to power scaling, for example, that's just completely invalid because I'm not using a power scaling definition. I'm just meaning exactly what the word means, above or to surpass. It's really just that. So, for example, if you transcend the third dimension, you have to be infinitely above it in every metric. You have to be 40. But I'm not actually arguing anything like power scaling. I'm just saying he's above or surpasses the definition, the established definition for the branch. Now I'll go over the definitions that we both posited. I'll go over both and just go from there and explain how. So the ability to perceive emotions is your definition. In others, through facial expression, body language, pictures, voices, and reasoning. So let's go over this. One, he had no facial expression that he could read with Jurgens. Next, body language, same thing. He'd only ever communicated with him through letters, and even when he first introduced himself to Jurgens, he said that he already understood Jurgens, and that's actually something that got Jurgens actually interested in the letters. And then from there, he actually believed that Johan was just unnatural, that he was superhuman and out of this world because of the things he knew, just somehow. So next, we're going to go to pictures. Same thing. Voices, same thing. Never met Jurgens once. And reasoning. What I'm arguing to reasoning is that it is impossible to infer this reasonably. Like, there's no way to say, well, he likes the color red. Now let me come up with all of his details of his past, like every single memory that led him to like red. It really doesn't make sense, especially because determinism isn't even established within context of monsters. There's no real reason to believe that. And then next, my definition, the accuracy with which individuals can identify emotions in themselves and others through facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language, as well as in abstract objects such as works of art. So going over this, right? Johan can identify perfectly down to every single detail. And when I say perfectly, I know you said it's probably not a good idea to use that word earlier, but when I say perfectly, I just mean without flaw. He never makes a mistake in his EP, and this has been established throughout the entirety of Monster. There have been no mistakes, at least that I can remember, though obviously I would welcome you to show any, where he's made a single mistake in seeing what someone will do, what exactly they will say, exact routes they'll take when they walk. For example, with Alex, where he knew where he'd go, he knew where Heckle would go, he knew where Tenma would go, he knew exactly what they would do after. And these are after he saw Heckle once, without Heckle even seeing him a single time. He just knew this. So going further, right? Facial expressions, once again, does not apply. Tone of voice does not apply. Body language does not apply, as well as in abstract objects such as works of art. So when we discussed this, we went over how the only really way that we could reasonably say that it actually works as EP would be if it is reasonably a cue you would generally expect to see within an emotion. So if you're crying, we can say you're distressed. If you're drawn to cry, we can say that character is expressing sadness or distress. These are just things that we can kind of say, right? Just because IRL, we've seen these things, so we can kind of apply them to what we see in fiction, and we can attribute them to art. However, once again, in Johan's case, this does not work because he has no cues, established cues that he would know. And in fact, if we go back to the Kinderheim statement, he stated in the realm of psychology, that being linked to their brainwashing and techniques to kill with words which come from an understanding. More evidence for this is actually Christoph, where Christoph was able to know exactly what Martin did in his past and use that to manipulate Martin. Christoph is nothing compared to Johan. Literally, he's considered an ant. Nothing is comparable to Johan within the narrative, except for the another monster in the light novel, who is the second monster, the axe murderer. But outside of that, no one is even comparable. And basically, Christoph can do this, where he can identify exact memories, and he can do this while talking to Martin, actually, but he did some prodding. Johan, on the hand, never does this. He just knows. That's the difference in their narrative. And then from here, what we know is that psychology is linked to their brainwashing narratives, right? They're manipulation, all these narratives. So if we look at Bonaparte, Christoph, or Johan, all linked. And then through the scan I sent, the two actually, it is established that Johan understood this and that it was almost an insult to him to try to teach him at Kinderheim because he just understood it. He just knew, right? Before they ever tried to teach him how to kill with words or psychology, he just knew it. It's just something intrinsic to him. So all of this, I think, paints a pretty fair picture of saying he transcends the branch not because he is completely independent of information, but because his information cannot be reasonably assumed to be EP, as we agreed, in fact, intuition, for example. So when we talked about intuition, you granted the fact that if I'm looking at a picture, right, and I intuitively, like subconsciously understand it, even though I didn't say, a tear equals distress. I didn't say this in my head. I didn't do any of that. I just knew, but I still used the cues. This can't even be attributed to Johan because he isn't like that. He doesn't need these cues. So even if it is intuition, he just intuitively knows. So yeah, you don't actually need to have, no information. In fact, you even granted that it then wouldn't be EP if there was no cues that you were intuitively understanding. There has to be some sort of cue. So if I just said, I see this, it's the letter the, and then I said, okay, you must be sad. That doesn't make sense. What cues did I see? Is it how you wrote the? It doesn't make sense. So these things, according to you and me, when we had a little meta debate in the beginning, don't fit EP, and for that reason, he's transcending over the model because the way he analyzes information does not make sense, and that would also support him not needing external stimuli within the context of the branch. And I mean, if that's about it, I probably have to go in 10, 15 minutes, so we should try to just get to conclusions, let the judge do the rest, but basically the crux of it, so.
Okay. So, a couple things that I'll go on, but before I do that, just kind of a quick follow-up question that I'm pretty sure I know the answer to, but just based on this, I want to confirm it. Are you making the case that Johan's ability here is in any way inherently supernatural or entirely based in emotional intelligence?
Supernatural, do you mean like hacks? Like using some sort of higher ability?
Essentially, yeah. Is everything he's doing the way that you envision it entirely based on pure intelligence? Whereas, if someone else had the exact same intelligence as Johan, they could also do it? Or is it some form of supernatural or hacks
That's
or something
contextually
specific to
independent.
him?
Within Monster, it's near superhuman, but it is possible. Though if we looked at a different verse, having his same intelligence, they most likely wouldn't have the same psychological abilities that he does. But once again, that's basically just a very common
I
theme
guess, yeah,
within
I guess
Monster.
basically to the first part, do you consider any part of this hacks or is it just intelligence? That's, I guess, more
No,
so.
it's not hacks. It's not
Not
hacks.
okay. That's what I thought you were arguing. I just wanted to confirm that you think it is
Yeah.
just.
And let's try to make this quite snappy. I have to go in 10,
Yeah. Okay. So
maybe 15.
basically, again, the last thing that I would assert with this is I actually would then partially agree with some of the things that you were saying up to a point, whereas that Johan is able to make certain inferences without the presence of certain types of information. However, the disconnect is where you're drawing the conclusion that makes him inherently superior to an EP model based on the way he's doing it, which is not the case. So, inherently, I'm going to go all the way back to both our definitions, kind of like you just did, in the fact that EP revolves around drawing conclusions about emotions or emotional states based on these different types of cues that we went back and forth on. So it would then logically follow that if you're not doing that, what you're doing is not EP. Therefore, in the way that you've described what Johan does is actually not EP at all. It's more based on intuition and his general understanding of psychology and people. You could make an argument that maybe it's also prediction based on the specific context, and if he's predicting certain elements of it. But again, what you've described has now actually gone to the realm of just not being EP at all, definitionally. And the point of that is that we've tried, in your definition, even forget my definition for a second, just even your definition, the accuracy of which individuals can identify emotions in themselves and others through facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and abstract objects such as works of art. So, identifying emotions in himself and others based on these factors, which you just argued, none of which are present. Therefore, based on your own argument that you just made, which I can't really believe you just made, but based on your own argument right there, Johan's feat definitionally cannot even be EP. So
Okay, so this is actually something I thought you'd go for.
If it's not EP at all, it again logically can't be transcending EP either. But so
okay, is that it? Is that it?
I'll be quick, but I've got a couple more things I wanted just to touch on, but I will be quick here. But then
Okay.
the second piece is still in line with the idea that EP is based on observable factors. If you're still trying to argue that Johan is making these judgments not based on observable factors, it erases the entire ability to verify these factors with either experience or knowledge. Whereas in the fact that in the example, if you see someone crying, you can associate that with sadness. If none of these factors exist, none of this ability to make associations exist, which is the whole basis of EP. And again, I didn't anticipate having to make this argument, but just by the way that you explained how you perceive Johan's EP here, it's just not EP. It's the closest thing I could guess based on the way that you're explaining this is just intuition. Because if there are no observable factors, no logical branches between them, and yet he still manages to come to conclusions, that's almost definitionally intuition. Which is why, again, just brief here, it can't be transcendent EP if it's not EP at all. So yeah, I'll stop there because you're short on time.
Yeah, so I'll just cover this really quick. So one problem is that you actually said that you'll just use my definition for that little part, but then you talked about intuition and how intuition then wouldn't be EP. That actually isn't true under my definition, only yours. But outside of that, right, just my little closing, I suppose, is the reason that it would actually still be EP is because the model, the branch, is limited in the fact that it has to be measurable through a test. So I'll actually give you the standard that they give in the model, the original, the one I'm using, the 4-branch model. It is that, one, it has to fit the criteria for a standard intelligence. How does it do this? Well, it has to be operationalized as a set of abilities that, one, are intercorrelated, two, relate to other extant intelligences, and three, develop with age and experience. Now, because of this, they have to make it so that you have very measurable cues. For example, tone of voice. If you're taking a test for this or that you're aging, you can basically, the more information you know, the more you have as reference to basically better, with accuracy, predict someone's emotions and understand them. However, with Johan, he doesn't actually need any of these things. He doesn't need experience, as shown in the Kinderheim statement. He just understood the curriculum, that being psychology and human understanding, better than anyone else there, the staff or anything. And that was basically like 6, 8 years old. So he just understands this. And then because of that, the reason it's like not intuition is because there is some sort of reasoning behind it. It is very conscious. But even if it was intuition, it doesn't actually matter because under my model, my definition, the one that you're using, that doesn't change anything. It can be intuitive. But once again, it really just doesn't matter because it's still EP given the branch is limited in its definition. It has to be measurable. Johan isn't measurable, therefore he transcends the branch. It's really that simple,
so
honestly.
That's again where I'll be brief here and closing points with that is your final statement here is again with a lot of these points, a leap in logic is the idea of when you're explaining EP is like a box. You have to be in the box to qualify as EP. What Johan is doing is what you've stated and what I've stated is objectively not in the box. You're then trying to say that means he completely transcends the box. I'm just saying it's not the same as being in the box. There is a very clear-cut difference there, and one being yours is a far more fantastical leap in logic than just saying what he's doing doesn't qualify as EP in the sense that it doesn't reach the standards of EP as defined by either model. And then to your points there, just quickly here, again, you talked about being intercorrelated and relating to other exit intelligence and developing the agent experience. None of these match what Johan is doing. You literally argued to the end, I'll go backwards here, Johan having this ability, from a very young age of childhood. Like, that is the opposite of developing with agent experience because he had it before having agent experience. Therefore, does not meet that criteria. Then just to keep going through these, relating to other exit intelligences as in other forms of emotional intelligence, again, if it doesn't qualify as any of these factors of normal EP, which again, you are arguing the same as me, it doesn't relate to these because it's this separate transcendent thing. That means it does not create this relationship with other forms of EP like social intelligence, verbal intelligence, whatever, because he's not using those factors. So again, doesn't qualify there. Then to the final point of it being intercorrelated with other emotional intelligence factors, again, you were kind of arguing the opposite. That being, again, he's coming to these conclusions without any form of what should be logical knowledge that would allow him to make these, qualifications. So you then trying to claim that these reasons prove that it's EP and transcendent feels highly contradictory because not only does he not meet any of those three standards, in fact, it feels like the opposite, where they would then, in conclusion, prove that what Johan's doing as you presented it cannot be EP at all. And as my final remark on this, if what EP is a box, if what Johan's doing is not in the box, it's not EP and therefore cannot be transcendent. I think looks like he left. So Fanta and Snow, I guess, deliberate amongst yourself as judges. However you want to work that out. Go from there. I don't know how you guys want to go about doing that. But yeah, just to reiterate what we had talked about in the initial, and you'll find it in the recording too.
Yeah,
just like the initial premises was probably kind of obvious, but his point was Johan transcends EP